Because I echo Jane in thinking how important these kinds of regular exchanges are, because as she said, this is a continuing discussion that's going on and on. What she didn't say about IMSC is that we're also planning then to launch a kind of record of what the situation looked like last year. And we're planning to do the same thing again. And the record will be in the form of a short book, which will be a composition effectively of at least some of the papers that were delivered last year and might well be again this year. And that is our sort of hidden agenda behind all this. But we'll see how things are going to go. Well, generally, you won't be surprised that I'm going to take this spirit of pessimism a bit forward, make us even more pessimistic than we were already, emphasising the point that Jane made, that this is a very unpredictable world and in many ways much more competitive. These are indeed interesting times. There are many big changes happening, with cascading surprises coming out of them that are catching people unexpectedly. So it raises the issue of how do we all, but in particular, how do navies and coast guards in this and other areas actually cope with the problem of unpredictability? And I think really that is at the background of the sort of issues that we'll be talking about over the next couple of days. Now, I'm just going to look very broadly at the overall context and just to set the scene and to open up some of the issues. And I think today, of all days, one has to really to start with it. The election of Trump. Fevered speculation on all sides about what it might all mean to us. And more precisely, what does he mean? And how should the rest of us take it? Speculation is one of those things that's intensely enjoyable, but so often pointless. But I can't resist engaging in it myself. He's plainly enjoying shocking people at the moment. A whole series of really quite radical appointments, which raise the prospect of, quite major upheavals across the whole width of policy that the United States has got anything to do with. But I think he's also expecting pushback. Systemic pushback, you might say, that he might call the deep state, if you like. And in a sense, what we might be seeing, I think, negotiating positions and warning shots rather than the definitive result, but I do not know, and nor do any of us know. But I think he is well aware, and his coterie are well aware, that in Congress, in the party, amongst the Democrats, the federal bureaucracy, the market, the media, allies, partners and adversaries, there is resistance. And this is going to be, I think, his target against all of these things. So it does raise the question that we all know what effectively he said so far. And the question is whether he actually really means it. Well, we are, I think, seeing some evidence of this already, really. In the sense of over climate change, for example, we've already seen the death, if you like, of the Paris Accord. We've seen some remarkable statements about Greenland, 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico in certain circumstances, and so on and so forth. But even if one looks simply at the environmental aspect of this, it means, well, less progress towards a hopeful future than we might anticipate, less compensation for the global south than they might be asking for, more differentials between countries that are observing the environmental constraints and those that aren't. But I think there are caveats, even there. The Paris Accords seems to me to be pretty dead in the water anyway. There was a report yesterday that said 1.5, at least for the time being, is completely unattainable in a way. It's not a realistic target. And when one thinks about the United States, an awful lot of the implementation of environmental concerns is not at the federal level, it's actually at the state level, where opinion is much more diverse. So there might be more continuity than we might think. After all, President Biden did retain some elements of the Trump administration before him, a pushback from liberal market approach, for example. And I think there's also a tendency to exaggerate the power of the White House. But against that, I think there is a pretty fundamental point that our colleague Hugh White in Australia made. And I'd like to read out what he says, because I think there's truth in it. He said this: the image of America as the benign leader of a liberal global order and the steadfast guardian of peace and stability around the world, Mr. Biden's vision, just doesn't wash with the great majority of Americans. It's even clearer now, he said, than it was in 2016, that America is not the country we thought it was. And he concluded, Americans no longer believe in the vision of US global leadership espoused by Washington's policy elites. One can see why he thinks that. After all, President Trump's second election was won on the basis of votes by people who knew what his first administration was. They knew what they were getting. They voted for it anyway. So effectively, one is not talking just about an errant politician, if you like. One is talking about something much broader than that within the United States. And I think that's something that we really do need to seriously think about what its consequences are. I think there are other things other than President Trump that we need to think about as well. Pressing the wrong button. Obviously, globalization and its future, US-China relations, the idea of global coalescence, something I'll come back to in a minute. So, and climate change, of course, and the next pandemic. So, there are 6 reasons for concern about whether globalization will continue, I think. Natural perturbations in the market are a concern. There's a rise in protectionist sentiment. There's collateral damage from conflicts. There's the impact of the fact that the costs and the risks of war are encouraging states to engage in economic statecraft, using economic power as an alternative to military power, which is better than using military power, you might argue, but it still threatens the system because it undermines the kind of trust on which the system is based. And then one thinks about collateral damage from conflicts, as we see happening because of what's happening both in the Red Sea and indeed the Black Sea. Even a direct attack by the unsympathetic Al-Qaeda and so forth, maritime crime and disorder. And let's not forget that the shipping industry itself has its own frailties. We need to think no further back than the Dali running into the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Portugal and the effect that had on trade, or the Ever Given being stranded in the Suez Canal and that kind of thing. So I think it could go either way. UNCTAD projections actually suggest a continued growth in world trade, but small, not as big that meant that it would reach pre-COVID levels yet. So a lot of it depends, not least on President Trump as overseeing, if you like, the world's top economy. But it's also an issue that affects, the whole business of US-China relations. The big issue, the elephant in the room. What will that be? Should we expect a rocky ride because of the identity of the new National Security Advisor, the new Secretary of State, much less emollient than Blinken? Should we think about some kind of cold peace not Cold War, but Cold Peace, something a little less stable down on that. Who knows? But we know that in addition to that, the leader of this world's second biggest economy has other worries. He has his own economic worries, of course, as we all know. There's a question of the future of state capitalism. There's Taiwan, the Davidson window. There's a problem of debt, problem that so many countries have, corruption, the lone wolf attacks that we see happening in China, and so on and so forth. And I think this kind of also raises the issue of coalescence, because you can see China's policy contributing to or standing against the idea of the world coalescing into two hostile blocs, like Europe did before the First World War. How seriously should we take China and Russia put together? There are obviously strains and limits within the association. Will an assertive Trumpian America increase it, or will an isolationist America weaken it? We really don't know. President Xi, though, will surely be concerned about the Russia-North Korea developing axis. What help has Russia given North Korea to compensate for all the missiles and all the troops that we see engaged in the Kursk region? And this kind of concern about a nearby neighbour behaving in a pretty provocative way must be of major concern, not just to China, but to everybody in the region. And Kim in North Korea does appear to be on a roll, as it were, blowing up sections of the overland routes to South Korea, launching balloons, testing its weapons, and in January last year abandoning the idea of reunification, but claiming that South Korea was now the principal enemy. Maybe to compensate for internal vulnerabilities in the regime. Possibility. But it also makes a nuclear point that I think is concerning as well. Now, if I was President Zelensky, I would be looking at the way that North Korea has been able to get away with things against major powers like the United States, and wonder whether being nuclear has got anything to do with it. Remember that the Ukraine gave up its nuclear capability in order to get a guarantee, in quotes, of its independence. What might Zelensky do in a long pause between this war and the next one? Go nuclear? What kind of example is that going to set? In other words, I'm saying, is what's the success, if you like, of North Korea going to act as something that's going to stimulate nuclear proliferation? And that really would be a big issue. And there are issues about Putin as well. Nuclear adventurism, I think China's concerned about that. Hence a partial support for Russia's war and so on. Concerns about the implications for China of deteriorating relations with Europe, simply on economic grounds. The effect of Russian activism in the Middle East, where China and Russia have different interests. China depends on oil from that region, but Russia doesn't. So, when one sees a coming together, even moderate, between Iran and Russia, that must be a concern, at least raising questions. So, I don't know how far coalescence is going to go, whether we are seeing a division of the world into two or three or whatever it is, but it's something that I think we need to be aware of. And then, of course, there are the unknown challenges that come about through strategic surprise. And most of us have been surprised about the extent of climate deterioration. The 1.5 broken already. Maybe not forever, but certainly broken at the moment. Nobody's surprised at the prospect of another pandemic, but one is surprised when it comes. So the idea of strategic surprise, I think, is something that we have to take extremely carefully. And all of this calls for cooperation between everybody, but between between the great powers over things that are important, really important, existential in some ways. But the recourse to great-zone operations, to economic statecraft, is going to undermine trust. Because if you don't wholly believe what the other side says in one area, do you necessarily believe them in another? Won't it undermine trust? The kind of trust that's necessary for progress for dealing with common problems like that one. The Munich Security Conference last year, 2024, thought that the lack of the necessary global cooperation was the world's biggest problem. And in Europe, we don't believe Putin's promises, we don't believe his threats either. So how do you deal with something like that? Or what do you think about that anyway? And then of course, there's the Ukraine, a war that nobody expected, taking a form that nobody expected. I would argue the same with Gaza. And then a totally unexpected collapse of the Syrian regime. These things happen. And when you've got a lot of kind of bubbling, forgotten wars and issues all around the world, Sudan, Myanmar, much of Africa, south of the Sahel, you've got all sorts of things simmering away that explode at almost any moment, involving all sorts of other people. It seems to me that we're heading into a stormy future. This is a picture I've been using a lot in lectures recently, because I think it does summarise the point that we are heading into uncertain times. But the problem is, who's going to lead us out? Where's the leadership coming that operates as the chairman of the board, if you like, who draws all the concerned stakeholders together and says, we've got a problem here, we've got to sort it out? I think one is seeing a problem, really, of weak leadership all around the world. Why is that the case? Well, I think a lot of regimes are facing increasing problems in raising the revenue that they need for the provision of domestic public goods. And that means that there's more discontent. That means that there's more of a focus on internal domestic matters than external ones. And I think this rising discontent is obviously a global phenomenon. In a sense, it brings us back to this old idea, really, of what's sometimes called the politics of personality. We have strong leaders around. You could argue that President Trump is one, President Xi is another, Putin might be regarded as another, but a lot of strong men have been falling recently. Strong leaders, I should say, or at least been shaken. Think of what happened to Assad. Modi in India got a less convincing support than he was expecting. Same thing happened in Turkey. Even the ANC in Southern Africa got a bit of a drubbing in the elections, and so on. So how strong are the strong leaders? Can they really be in a position to lead in the way that we expect? Putin's self-absorption with his domestic problem and the Ukraine as well means that, I doubt whether he's got much capacity there. Trump, well, chaotic in the last administration. What's it going to be like in the next one? Does one want to go where he would lead? I think even President Xi in China is pursuing the defense of the party's legitimacy with a vigor that suggests there's some doubt about it. And certainly a contrast to the kind of weak leadership one sees in Europe at the moment, where prostrated by domestic discord, the rise of the right, and somewhat with regards to crisis in democracy, you see France, Germany, so many other countries faltering in current policies and certainly not being in a position to lead. Even in this part of the world, we see South Korea with its presidential crisis at the moment, and even some weakness in Japan too. So I think there is a general worrying issue of the problem of agency. Who is actually in charge? of this situation. And we do see the increased agency of non-state actors, people like the Houthis, for example, who managed to propel themselves into the first division of actors from being a kind of medieval hill tribe. In an extraordinary extent, they're now a major actor, taking away control. To what extent does Iran actually control what's happening in Yemen? A lot, but not completely, I would say. And that's, I think, even before the Gaza war was true of Iran, much of its axis of resistance around Israel. So, you know, we're in a situation where Azerbaijan tells off Russia in no uncertain terms for that accident which brought down the Azerbaijan airlines. It's just a different world where it's not so much that the strong bully the weak are kind of bullying the strong in some ways. And that raises the issue of how strong is strong these days. Where do we get the leadership from, and so on? So, to round off that kind of review of some of the big issues, where does that leave us in Southeast Asia? And it seems to me that there are three questions that we might seriously think about. Three possibilities. Is Southeast Asia, individually or collectively, going to simply be bystanders? Effectively, people who stand on the edge of the football match and cheer on one side or another, or don't, but have no agency in what happens on the field. Are they going to be victims of what goes on? For example, you know, the dramatic effect that a rise in protectionism might have on the current position of Southeast Asia economically. Or maybe they're going to be beneficiaries in the way that you might say that China moving some of its industry into Southeast Asia's way of getting around American sanctions was to the benefit of Southeast Asia. Could all of that happen? It doesn't seem to me entirely impossible, shall we say. Or can one see a situation where Southeast Asia does actually get into a situation where it can begin seriously to collectively defend its own regional interests? I know that ASEAN's been talking about this for decades. I know progress has been slow. Are we moving into a more fractured world, which is going to increase the incentives for local states to try to forget their differences, or at least shelve them in the possibility that a bit more cooperation between them might be possible in order to defend the region's interests against the rest of the world, if you like. And the third option, talked about quite a lot, is whether Southeast Asia could in some way be a kind of bridging activity, or a form of bridging within a coalescing world, kind of filling the gaps, kind of being a kind of neutral arena in which things of major interest could be discussed. It's not exactly leadership, but it's kind of providing a framework in a sense. Maybe that might be a possibility. And then, of course, getting back to the heart of the matter and the sort of thing that I think James was suggesting that is going to focus the attention of the maritime security program for the next couple of years or so. How is all this going to affect the maritime sea, and in particular, navies and coast guards? What one sees in this region quite clearly is, as you would expect in a maritime centrality, a great deal of, let's call it the neutral word, modernisation. But a kind of modernisation that's going on that is creating greater aspiration and greater quality. We're not talking about like-for-like replacement. We're talking about replacing like with something better. And this is sort of common throughout the sort of region. So it's certainly happening. It's not happening by accident. It's happening because this is a quintessentially maritime regime, maritime region, for all the sorts of reasons that we think about. This, therefore, what navies want to do, if you like, isn't surprising. It's the sort of thing that we should expect. And there are, therefore, these inexorable demands for modernisation from countries whose economies are growing fast and turning into one of the major players in the world economy. Again, something that we should expect. But if we were a room full of fleet planners facing the kind of unpredictable work that I was talking about, how on earth do we prepare? How do we prepare when we're tasked with the immediate business of replacing, let's say, a class of corvettes with something else that we, in a process that we know is going to last 10 years before we decide what we want, and then maybe another 10 years to build what we want or get what we want, and then an operating life of 20 years after that. So we're trying to prepare for a future world that's actually more than tomorrow. It's 20 years, 30 years in advance. How on earth do we do that? And how much is the danger that fleet planners in this region will throw out their hands and say, it's too difficult, and all I'm going to do is to prepare for the worst. In other words, to take as bleak a view of the maritime future as one can reasonably imagine. Base one's preparations on that, and then create in other navies in the region and elsewhere a worry that that's the world that they've got to prepare against, creating a kind of stimulus response process that turns modernisation into arms racing, greater competition, and so on. A really tricky issue, it seems to me. So I think that the region's naval planners could do with as much advice on what they should prepare for and how they should do it as we could reasonably provide. And I think that should be our aim.
Thank you very much, Prof, for setting the scene, so to speak, but really already asking some very provocative questions. For most part of the lecture, I keep thinking like, where's the Southeast Asian component to this? So we are supposed to do the work on highlighting the Southeast Asian avenue to this. Prof has agreed to take some questions. We actually have about 30 minutes, so I'll open the floor for comments, questions, and general discussion around the group. But I'm going to exercise the prerogative of the chair to ask Jeff a few leading questions in a way, because I really don't want to do so much work myself, right? Prof, the worst case scenario that you highlighted earlier on for naval planners, right? In your mind, what would be the worst case scenario for Southeast Asia? So that's question number one. But to circle back to the role of Southeast Asia and ASEAN in that sense. So while the navies, and the Ministry of Defense plans for the worst case scenario, you alluded that there may be a role for Southeast Asia, maybe ASEAN, but it's two different things there, right? To play that role of a bridging role. But in your mind, then is ASEAN that right institution, or we need to look at evolving that to make it more palatable? Because all the discussion about why there's unilaterals around is because our partners are thinking that maybe ASEAN is not the right fit and stuff like that. So if you could tackle that first, that being one. Perhaps I'll also invite a round of questions.
Thank you very much, Prof, for a very enlightening presentation on the state of affairs of the world. My question is that throughout your presentation, you have not referred to global institutions or rules and norms. Where do you see those in the current picture of the world that you are trying to draw on? Where do you see those moving towards now that we have a very notorious leader in the Western Pacific elected and inactive? seconded by Geoffrey.
Okay, thank you very much, sir, for the interesting brief and read. So, in my opinion, maritime security in the Pacific is very difficult to do because some of the reasons, like the tension of geopolitics, the diverse national interest, and lack of bilateral framework. And then you mentioned that strategic surprise, climate, and the next pandemic, and also you can work. But the most important thing is in our field now is cyber security threat. Why this? Because of the weight of information sharing. One. The second is weight of joint cooperation with other countries. It is very dangerous in the region, not only for the in each country but regionally. So, how to avoid this and how to handle this? Maybe we come with the basic one for the cooperation, like sharing information. For all time, for the Navy, it's very difficult to find what is we get from the information nothing, small. But we come from the basic one, like how to do this, how to format the information, how to feature and to do. And then my question is on that how it's recommended. And then second question: what type of cooperation during the tension is high in the regional? What type of cooperation? I mean, during the tension is when the people prepare for the anti-submarine warfare and then surface warfare. So, what type of cooperation? Now is only just training, maybe, and what type of cooperation we have to increase for the tension side? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emerald. Emerald Salim is head of the Seapower Center for Information.
Yeah. Yes, interesting. I just want to emphasize the fact that I'm raising questions, not providing answers. That these are sorts of things that I'm really reluctant to provide an answer, but I, in some cases I will give you a hint as to what I think. But you know, the real point of an opening session like this is to do this, is to identify the agenda that we're going to be talking about, rather than to tell you what the answer is, so that we can all pack up and go home this afternoon. Because I don't know what the answer is anyway in most cases. So, you know, having said all that, how to respond rather than answer the questions that I've been asked. What's the worst case? I'm pretty clear about that. I think the worst case is actually conflict between Russia and China. Sorry, not Russia, China. The other one, America. Yeah. You know, it seems to me that it's not a possibility that one can totally exclude. One is seeing both navies using each other in, choose the neutral phrase, the facing threat. In other words, simply identifying the kind of capabilities that might be needed in a bad future, if you like. I don't think it necessarily means that conflict is, you know, and it certainly doesn't mean that conflict is inevitable, but it's not one can totally exclude, any more than you can totally exclude the idea that a major conventional war has been taking place in Europe for the last 3 years without anybody kind of getting involved anywhere else. Even in Europe, if you see what I mean. So it's, you know, these possibilities do exist. But if you think through the consequences of further deterioration in the relation between those two countries, you know, that bleeds into economic relations, bleeds into the posturing of military forces, bleeds into the exacerbation of the situation in Taiwan, you know, the impact on confidence in the kind of confidence that you need that international economies are based on must suffer significantly. And if that suffers significantly, then so does everything else. So it does seem to me that that's the kind of worst case, a situation where you really are facing the prospect of a major war in the immediate vicinity and in the not too distant future possibly. So I think that's the worst case. Do I think it very likely? No, I don't. Because it seems to me that the prospects of that are so appalling for all concerned that, you know, nobody will engage in it. However, mistakes happen, accidents happen, people get into situations that they didn't think they were going to be in. I think it's perfectly clear that when Mr. Putin went into Ukraine, the fact that the first forces over the border were not the military in some cases, but actually were crowd control specialists, kind of underlined the point that he was not imagining that he was about to get into a 3-year war, which is going to kill or maim 500,000 Russians so far, and will probably maim the Russian economy for the next 10, 15, 20 years. So he did not realise that, and these things do happen. And nor actually did Zelensky, who repeatedly turned down warnings of the imminence of a major Russian move. So surprises happen, if you like. So you cannot exclude that sort of possibility. But the risks and the costs of doing it, I'm trying to lump all the questions together, if you see what I mean, are such that there is recourse to other ways of trying to influence people's behaviour. I'm talking about economic statecraft, I'm talking about grey zone operations, and all that kind of thing that have provided so much cause for debate in recent years. Now, as I said when I was talking, that is a lot better than fighting wars, clearly. But nonetheless, it's far from ideal, partly because there's so much collateral damage, so much unexpected. You never know where it's going to end up. The Russian NotPetya attack on Odessa in 2017, for example, NotPetya, was intended really to be an attack on Odessa and the port facilities there, but the major victim was Maersk, the Danish shipping company. And that kind of collateral effect of, in this case, a cyber assault, if you like, was extremely serious. So there's that problem, that these kind of alternative ways of exerting coercion, even in an extreme form, a kind of other form of war, if you like, have their risks and have their uncertainties also, and can get a lot worse than you think they are. But I think there's a more insidious danger there too. And that insidious danger is where you get to a situation where you think the other side are misbehaving. They say they are not, but you're pretty clear they are, will lead to you misbelieving what they say. And that lack of trust, that lack of acceptance, if you like, of every sort of public declaration of correctness becomes unbelievable. You kind of whittle away at the basic principles of trust that any kind of community depends on. And, you know, if you're talking in a situation where you just don't trust what the other side says, you get into the sort of situation where you start blaming each other when things go wrong. And, you know, over COVID, for example, we all saw examples of that. And also on climate change. So, you know, it kind of weakens your capacity not only to keep the peace, but also to solve the huge problems that threaten the peace if you engage in these kind of grey zone operations, because it whittles away at principle. It whittles away at reliability of what states say and do. And that really gets onto the question about rules. It seems to me that the problem is that if you move away from the concept of some kind of order that does have rules that are generally observed, the alternative is not so much an order that's based on a different set of rules, it's an order that has no rules. And if you are in a situation, get into a situation like that, you're talking about an order in which the only rule is the rule of force. You know, jungle law, effectively. So it does worry me when I see clear evidence that the rules are being bent in all sorts of different ways, legally, economically, and so on. And as you say, you know, many would fear that what we're seeing in the United States is a classic rule bender, or breaker, indeed. Somebody who doesn't sort of, but he's not the only one, that's the point. And if you get to a situation where many of the major decision takers are less than wholly persuaded of the necessity of behaving the rules, following the rules, you are in trouble. And that means undermining the value of all international institutions. It explains why, I think, the United Nations has been such a big player in dealing with issues like Ukraine. Why it's been completely helpless, it seems to me, in terms of sorting out the Gaza war, for example, compared to the countries who have agency because they're supplying arms or money or whatever the case may be. So I think that's a really good question. It's a really worrying question, but it's a consequence of grey zone operations and lack of trust, and it breeds, and it's something that, you know, gets cumulatively worse, if you like. Then going back to the last question, which is cybersecurity and so on. How do you cope with a problem like that? Well, I think in all forms of grey zone operations, you've got a choice. One is to deter by denial. In other words, to try and show the adversary in one area. Let's talk about cable cutting. It's a simple thing. Well, you know, comparatively anyway. You deter by showing the other side that their cable cutting device is not going to work. That basically you've got resilience, you've got redundancy. Somehow or other you've managed to defend them, all the information is going up and down, and whatever the case may be, by developing alternate cables, by, you know, defending the data centers and all that sort of thing. Or you can deter by punishment. In other words, if they do it to you, you can do it back. And they know that, you have to demonstrate that. It's much more dangerous, but maybe it's more effective. It's a question, right? It's not an answer. And I think those people who advocate deterrence by punishment rather than deterrence by denial would make the point that if you simply react to what the other side are doing, you are likely to incur disproportionate cost, because it will cost you a lot more to defend the system than it does then to attack it. You know, it's like the Houthis firing drones at ships in the Red Sea. It costs navies a lot more to shoot the drone down than it does the Houthis to send the drone. So that means that the defender, if you like, is always disproportionately punished by higher cost. And the other thing, of course, and you as a military man will know this, you are ceding the advantage of the initiative to the other side permanently. It means that they're the ones who establish the rules of the game. So I can see the generality of arguments that says, in other words, we escalate. And if you attack us, we go back. So what's my answer to the question in cyber or any other form of grey zone operations? I think it's a question of that can't be answered in the general. I think you have to look at the specific case, and so specific that you're talking about one country and another country in a particular time in a particular place. And in that case, it might make more sense to do that rather than this. I don't think it's a general answer to the question. And I'll basically argue that that's the case. The other thing, and you mentioned it yourself, is training. You know, in an unpredictable world, we're bound to get things wrong. Almost inevitably, actually. You all know this, the old adage about, you know, plans are fine until you contact the enemy. we're all going to be caught by surprise. All of our original ideas are going to be wrong. What you have to train your people to do is to respond quickly. So it's a question of agility. It's a question of the capacity to react to something totally unexpected very quickly. And that calls for a sort of intellectual liveliness and knowledge of past experience and where that all gets us to. And I'm banging the drum of the historian. Is to be familiar with process, with process past experience, in other words. To look at what's happening, really to study it, to work out what the conclusions that you might draw from it are, to take action accordingly, but then to be able to respond when it turns out your answer is wrong. Big demand. But professional military education, training, and things like this is absolutely critical.
If I can invite second round, we have from the rest of us. Please put up your time card so that I can call you.
Wonderful. Jeff, thank you as ever for the insightful thoughts and remarks. I wonder if I could ask you something that you touched on towards the end of your talk about what navies, how navies should be responding to the type of challenges that you set out. In particular, the question really is about what is your sense of navies and military maritime organizations in Southeast Asia in terms of learning from the experiences of Red Sea, the Black Sea, the Baltic, and how that is shaping, certainly in the European context, thinking or the gap between readiness and investment, and in particular your point you were making, how to reduce the time between the moment we're thinking about the ship, getting the ship out at sea commissioned, and use it. So that's a key concern that really is driving that conversation of the tension between readiness and investment closer to home. What is your sense of that particular aspect of lessons that are being looked at in Europe, being brought to this part of the world, and if it is a matter that's being considered, does that play into the modernization process that you were talking about earlier? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Postal. And a lot of pessimism, of course, and perfectly I'm in agreement with you in that sense. And one of the things that you highlighted is the Trump administration coming in and the kind of uncertainties that bring along with it, in a sense, in terms of the US role, US involvement in the Indo-Pacific. But also at the same time, there are a number of different conflicts, again, that you highlighted, Ukraine, the European war, the Middle East, and so on and so forth. And of course, things are simmering in the Indo-Pacific region, in Southeast Asia, Northeast, and different areas. Amidst all this, again, there's an urgent need for naval modernization, building up of capabilities. And in many countries, even the traditionally big maritime powers, they have gone through various cycles of modernization, and they are ripe for another round of big modernization plans, in a sense. But all of this, and especially for, there is also the need for capacity building for a number of smaller developing countries in the region in order to monitor the ship movements and so on and so forth. There's a whole range of capability development that needs to happen. What is the role that you see for multilateralism and unilateral partnerships in this regard, given that multilateralism is not going anywhere? So how do you see the role for this? And unilateral partnerships, I look at it again, both in terms of capability development, but also in terms of framing rules of the road. But you again highlighted, and I again in agreement with you, lack of trust, rule of force, which is what is happening. So again, how do you build certain amount of confidence among major powers and the developing countries in the region? Because the conflicts are not going to go away, and your ability to have continued access to the maritime space is also at risk, in a sense. So how do you work around through multilateralism as a process to bring some amount or some semblance of rules of the road in the meantime? Because otherwise, whether it is a code of conduct or sort of a more of a legally binding agreement, is there a starting point somewhere, some baby steps that can be taken through a minilateral process first before you're elevating it to a larger grouping in a multilateral setting? Thank you.
Thank you, Will James, Assistant Professor at RCS. Thank you for a very good scene set, Professor. Question that you mentioned around the North Korea, Russia and China angle, and I just wanted to sort of get your read on what you think the motives are for Russia in this relationship. You know, it's quite obvious for North Korea, but is this relationship from Russia's perspective, is it a sign of weakness that it's unable to get lethal aid from China and therefore it's turning to North Korea? Or is it a play on the part of both parties to kind of demonstrate their agency or autonomy from China in what is an increasingly asymmetric alliance here? And then second, if I may, you've mentioned around economic warfare a few times and the Houthi drone attacks in the Red Sea. But I just wondered, thinking historically, isn't this just a temporary development in the changing character of war, in the sense that the defence technically for the moment is on the back foot and offence has the advantage? But as always, these things even out. There will be defensive systems that will come into play that will eventually be produced at scale that will level the playing field. You think about IEDs in the campaigns in Afghanistan and Iraq. You know, for a moment, the British and Americans were caught off balance by that, but then eventually you produced enough vehicles at scale that had defensive measures in place. And the same could be said perhaps at sea. You're talking about directed energy weapons like Dragonfire that might be deployed on ships soon. So if that was done at scale, perhaps that would sort of turn the balance against these offensive weapons at sea. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Proctor, you are the author of a very successful textbook on sea power, which I believe you are revising. So, what do you see as the future of sea power in this turbulent world that you have been talking about? You look at the configurations of naval inventories. Does the carrier still have a future in naval sea power? The Chinese are building huge numbers, the largest. But you look at what's happening in the Ukraine. So, just as the battleship, the battlecruiser gave way after World War II, what do you see as the future of the carrier group and what will replace it in sea power?
The 5th edition is coming out by the end of the year.
Yeah, gosh, a lot of good questions which I will respond to, if not answer. I can remember what they all were. Yes, Alessio first. I think, yes, Southeast Asia is part of the maritime world. Because it's part of the maritime world, it is affected by everything that's going on. I think the tendency that there is in some quarters to think that somehow or other one can pull up the drawbridge and not be affected by what's happening elsewhere is probably rather short-sighted. I think one interesting aspect of the relationship between Russia and North Korea is the fact that we've now got 10, 12 or whatever it is, 1,000 North Korean troops operating the other end of the Eurasian landmass. That kind of symbolises the fact that we are all in the same boat. Which particular seat in the boat we have to be on is less important than the fact that we're all in the same boat. We're all in the same boat because of pandemics and climate change and all the rest of it as well. So, starting point is to argue that Southeast Asia is part of the global community, and therefore when it comes to its neighbours, you would expect the same kind of problems and issues that navies everywhere face. And you're quite right, the whole problem of acquisition, if you like, is a real problem, because you're preparing for something that's way off now, but you're going to be producing something that might be used in a completely different way, in a completely different context than you designed it for. So, isn't it possible somehow or other to compress the process? That's the ideal. That's what almost every fleet designer everywhere would like to do. But it turns out to be quite difficult. And there are a whole number of different reasons why to example, what you might call the slice of the action syndrome. If you're only sufficiently rich to have one major program going through, you as a submariner, or you as an aviator, or you as a surface warfare officer, or whatever the case may be, will want part of the action. So that ship will need to have that kind of capability for you to be a contented member of it. And that's happened. It's called gold plating. And it's something that means that, you know, nothing is settled. You're always talking about changing the specification as you go on. And that's partly genuinely in response to the advance of technology. If you're going to build this one-off series, you want it to be as good as possible. So you want it to incorporate the very latest that's available. But out there, the civilian industry are producing new ideas almost all the time. And you're trying to have to respond to it like that. So I think it's a common problem. Everybody's got that sort of problem, it seems to me. And it raises the issue of readiness. You know, I think when you think about readiness, you've got to think about it not just in terms of today, but next week and next month and 10 years' time. In a sense, as the last Secretary of Navy said back in the United States, you can be too ready today if the consequence of that is that you're not going to be ready enough tomorrow. And that's possible. If you devote all your effort to today's thing, you might be undermining your capability to respond to what's happening tomorrow. So readiness is a consumable, and it's something that you've got to, you kind of allocate, as it were, over the years. And this is really difficult. And it seems to me that the more process there is, the more we try to look at the way that navies are handling this kind of thing, wherever they happen to be, whatever size they happen to be, the more we will slowly accumulate what's best practice. But I think it's a gradual and very difficult process, I really do. But it just kind of reveals the point that you know, simply by virtue of what they are and where they operate, navies have things in common wherever they are. They're not unique in that. You can say the same thing about other things as well, but it's important to realise that point, I think. On the question of multilateral, minilateral, and all of that, what's the best way of dealing with issues? I do think that one is beginning to see some reinforcement of the notion of the coalition of the willing. In other words, if there is a particular issue in a region which, let's say, 3 countries happen to feel more strongly about than others do, then it kind of makes sense for them to engage in a coalition, like the trilateral thing over the Sully Sea, for example, or like the Malacca Straits Patrol. They're brilliant examples of that sort of thing. So I think rather than the grand solution that solves every problem, toning it down a bit to focus more particularly on limited geographic areas, limited range of threat you're trying to deal with, is pragmatic and probably more realistic. I think in terms of Africa, the African maritime strategy that they've taken a long time to talk about, for a reason that's very obvious, and that is that they all have different skin in the game. Some of them are concerned about drugs, some of them are concerned about illegal fishing, some of them are concerned about terrorism as a top priority. So where you begin to get a kind of coming together of groups, small groups within larger groups, they can be pragmatic solutions, not solutions to the problem, but ways of managing the problem at the very least. So my sense is that is probably a sensible and more realistic way to go. On Will's question about what is the relationship of Russia and North Korea actually about, well, frankly, I don't know, but I do think there are 2 aspects to it. I do think that there is a very real sense that Russia, now less than it did, because it's been able to ramp up its defensive industry much more than many people in the West thought it was possible to do, to the extent that they can now produce a lot more of what they need. in terms of missiles and things like that. But they have taken an awful lot of stuff from North Korea, and that in itself is intrinsically worthwhile. What one's got to remember about President Putin, though, is that it's a thing that's not often said, but it's true. He is a racist, in the sense that he is concerned about Russians, and by Russians he doesn't mean everybody who lives in Russia. By Russia he means white Russians, people like him, in other words. And he is really concerned about the impact on the war, on what is already a deteriorating demographic situation. So if he finds himself stuck in an attritional war, which is going to lose lots of people, and as I've said, very difficult to measure, but the reliable estimates suggest we're talking about 500,000 soldiers who are either dead or so badly injured they can't get back to the battlefront, plus at least another 500,000 who fled the country. You're talking about a major loss in future, quote, Russian babies. You're talking about a demographic shift that he is very unhappy about. He doesn't talk about it, of course he does. But nonetheless, if you look at where a lot of the troops are actually coming from, they're not coming from Moscow. Oh dear me, no. And they're not coming from St. Petersburg. They're coming from those outlying provinces where people are less than Russian, if you see what I mean, where they're poor and where they're responding to very generous incentives to actually join the military and doing very well out of it if they survive. There's no question about that. So I think there is a genuine military need there that's now less about missiles, more about people. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if we saw further contingents of North Koreans appearing in the war if it goes on, just for that sort of reason. So I think there are pragmatic military reasons for it. I think you're right. I think there is a concern in Russia and China. I'm a bit of a skeptic about China myself. I think they have things in common, but I think they have an awful lot of things that are not in common as well. And I think the idea that the great Russia, if you like, is beholden to Beijing is something that is unwelcome to President Putin. So anything that he can do to increase Russia's agency with President Xi, I think he will do. And reminding China, if you like, that China's not the only option. In a sense of the way of doing it. So I think there's an element to that as well. You then made the question, and as a historian, this really appeals to me. I'm quite sceptical about the idea of disruptive technology that's permanently so. Because it seems to me that very often the technology that produces the problem, in due course, is the technology that produces the solution. And you are quite right. There are all sorts of people spending an awful lot of energy and time on counter-drone technologies. And I would be amazed if they're not successful. And as evidence of that, I think you can see you contrast, the success so far, touch wood, of all the warships in the Red Sea and being able to shoot everything down, with the Ukrainian, the Russian experience in the Black Sea. So I think that what's happening in the Red Sea is more typical of the future than what's happening in the Black Sea, if you see what I mean. But it comes at a cost, and it comes at investment, and it's just a reminder that what we're talking about in navies is nearly always really expensive, and that is a problem because trying to match resources and commitments, a standard problem, is not going to improve. It's going to be a real problem for navies in the future. And then Mr. Kwan raised the classic about the big ship. Where does the big ship go from here? There was a lot of very exciting speculation when the Russians lost their cruiser. That this was an indication, if you like, that the era of the big ship was over. And yet, at the same time, as a universal trend everywhere, in this area as much as anywhere else, one is seeing small ships get bigger. one is seeing countries building carriers either for the first time or reviving their previous capacity to do so. And you know, the disconnect between the view that some of the big ships have had their day and what is actually happening either indicates that all the world's navies have got something radically wrong, or there's something radically wrong with the expectation that the big ships have had their day. I think it raises a more substantial issue, though, which I think there is more strength in, which is what we're talking about in the future is more and more systems, not platforms. That you're talking about a web of capabilities that all come together. It may include all three services, include cyber, include space, and all the rest of it, in which everything's got a part to play, and there will be a part played by the big ship. But there will also be a part played by the small ship that network together, if the cyber communications hold together, that can operate as a form of diffused concentration, if you like. Instead of being all concentrated in a few big platforms, that power is spread out a lot amongst a lot of the smaller platforms that actually can act as though they were the big platform, a bit like a drone swarm, in other words. So I think we're seeing evidence of both of those sorts of patterns. So I don't think the big ship will be as dominating, perhaps, as it was in the past, but I still think it will play an indispensable role, particularly in situations of less than total conflict. That's me talking too much, and also yielding to the temptation to say what I think rather than what I think you'll be thinking about it. I apologise for that.
No, thank you for that. I think everyone will agree with me that we're off to a roaring start. Tokuchi Sensei, I'm sorry, if I can call on you in the next session, please. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we have got our marching orders as well into what to think about, but also, I'm sure, if this is the background into thinking about the specific topics and themes that we're going to cover in the next 1.5 days, I think 1.5 days is indeed not going to be enough. But in the meantime, we are going for a very quick break. As you can see, that I'm usually a very lousy timekeeper. So you really only have 5 minutes now to get your refreshment. Please, you're invited to bring your refreshment, fresh cup of coffee in here and join us for the next session. But before that, please join me in thanking Professor Teal and our